The invitation came on a quiet morning. She had just finished tidying her small apartment and was sipping tea when the message arrived. It was from the community center. A simple note asking if she could play a short piece at a local gathering. They called it a casual event, just a small group of neighbors and friends who loved music. They said they didn't need anything fancy, just a simple tune. She stared at the message for a long time. A small tune. That was all they wanted. It seemed so easy and yet so heavy at the same time. She had been playing piano for years, practicing alone in her room, often late into the night. Her fingers knew the keys, but her heart sometimes feared the outside world. She had played in front of friends before, but a small crowd of strangers was different. The thought made her chest tighten, but there was also a spark inside her, a feeling that this was a chance she could not ignore. Her apartment was filled with the quiet hum of the morning. Light fell softly across the room, touching the worn piano keys that sat in the corner. She walked over and ran her fingers over them, feeling the familiar smoothness and the slight coolness under her touch. She closed her eyes and imagined the room at the community center, filled with people she had never met. What would they expect? Would they notice the years she had spent learning alone? Would they hear the music inside her or just see a shy girl trying to play a simple tune? She packed her small bag carefully. Sheet music, a water bottle, and a notebook filled with ideas she had been writing down for months. The notebook was secret, a place where she poured her emotions into notes and melodies that never left her room. Today, she decided some of those notes might finally leave the pages. She paused at the door, taking a deep breath. It was a short walk to the community center, but it felt like a long journey through her own nerves and doubts. The streets were quiet, the sun warm on her face. She kept her pace steady, her mind thinking of the tune she had chosen. It was simple as they had asked, but she had a feeling that simple could also be powerful if played with care. She imagined the small gathering, the chairs in neat rows, the gentle hum of conversation as neighbors greeted each other. The thought made her stomach twist with a mix of excitement and fear. When she arrived, the room was already half full. People were chatting in small groups, laughing softly, their faces turned toward each other rather than the piano in the corner. She felt their eyes on her as she entered, and for a moment, she wished she could disappear. But she reminded herself why she had come. She had come to play, to share a part of herself that no one had seen yet. She walked to the piano, her fingers brushing the keys lightly, as if to test the air around them. A few people nodded politely at her, and someone whispered that they were looking forward to something nice and simple. She smiled faintly, but inside, she felt a storm. Simple and nice. That was all they wanted. Yet she knew the music in her fingers was more than simple. It carried years of quiet mornings, of practice when no one watched, of dreams she had whispered to herself late at night. She adjusted the bench and sat down. The keys felt cool beneath her fingers, familiar and welcoming. She looked at the small audience, their faces polite, curious, some skeptical. The pressure pressed lightly against her chest. She could almost hear their thoughts. Just play the simple tune. Nothing more. Just what they expected. She closed her eyes for a moment and let the memories flow in. Her first lesson. A kind older musician who had believed in her even when she doubted herself. The long evenings practicing. The tiny victories when a melody finally came together. All of it came rushing back, and for a moment she felt stronger. The room grew quieter as she prepared to play. She opened the sheet music and let her fingers hover above the keys. The first note sounded soft, almost shy, but it carried a warmth that filled the corners of the room. She played the first few measures carefully, listening to each sound, feeling it resonate in her chest. The audience leaned forward slightly, nodding politely, expecting nothing more than what they had requested. A simple tune. As she continued, she allowed herself to breathe with the music. Each note became a little louder, a little more confident. She thought about the people who had doubted her before, the whispers that she was too quiet, too shy, too inexperienced. She ignored them now. This was her moment, her music. She imagined it spreading beyond the room, touching hearts, telling a story of quiet determination and hidden strength. She caught a few eyes in the audience, people who seemed genuinely curious. A child sat at the front, eyes wide, fascinated by the movement of her hands. An older man shifted in his chair, listening intently, his lips pressed together as if trying to hold back a smile. She felt a small wave of courage. Perhaps they were starting to hear what she had always felt, the fire hidden behind the calm surface. Her mind wandered briefly to her apartment, to the quiet nights of practice. How many times had she dreamed of a moment like this, when someone outside her room would hear the music in her heart? And now she was here, not just playing a simple tune, but connecting with the people in the room through every note. She realized that the tune, while simple in appearance, could carry a depth of feeling that words could not express. The room remained still as she finished the first part of the piece. She lifted her hands from the keys and felt a small, satisfied smile spread across her face. It had gone better than she expected. There was a spark of connection, a small recognition that the music meant something more than just a few notes on paper. She glanced at the audience, seeing polite smiles, gentle nods, and eyes that seemed to say they were noticing something special. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment, the quiet thrill of accomplishment. The invitation had seemed simple, just a request for a basic tune, but it had given her an opportunity to step into the light, even briefly. She had felt the fire inside her, the passion that had been waiting for years to emerge. It had started with a single note, a soft sound that carried her story, and she knew that the evening had only just begun. As she prepared to continue, she reminded herself to stay present. Each note mattered, each pause held meaning. The simple tune was just the beginning, and she was ready to let the music take her where it needed to go. The room, quiet and attentive, seemed to hold its breath, waiting to hear what she would do next. And in that moment, she realized that the simple request had become something far more significant than anyone, including herself, had imagined. The small room seemed to shrink around her as she sat at the piano, her fingers lightly touching the keys. The polite smiles of the audience were comforting in one way, yet they also carried expectations that pressed down on her. They wanted a simple tune, nothing more, and she felt the weight of those words settle into her chest. She had always been careful, practicing quietly in her room, never wanting to draw attention. But now, attention was exactly what was coming, whether she was ready for it or not. She thought about the people who had doubted her over the years. Neighbors who said she would never be good enough, classmates who had laughed at her when she played for them in school, teachers who suggested she should focus on simpler things. Those memories mixed with the present moment, the hush of the room, the expectant eyes, and her heart beat faster. This was not just a performance. It was a test of everything she had carried silently within her. Her fingers hovered above the keys. She wanted to start with the simple melody, the tune they had asked for, but she also knew that each note could carry more than its surface meaning. She closed her eyes briefly, imagining herself back in her small room, where no one watched, where her mistakes didn't matter, and her music was free. That feeling of freedom gave her a small surge of courage. Maybe she could bring a little of that freedom here. A voice in the room spoke softly, reminding her to play the simple piece. She nodded, her hands pressing down the first note. The sound was gentle and soft, almost shy, but it was steady and sure. She could feel the vibrations travel through her fingers, up her arms, and into her chest. The music was no longer just a sound. It was a heartbeat, a rhythm she had lived with for years. She let it fill her mind, letting the pressure of expectation become a backdrop instead of a barrier. The audience listened politely. Some nodded along, others whispered quietly, and a few watched her with mild curiosity. She could feel their thoughts pressing in. Keep it simple, don't overdo it. And yet, she felt something else rising inside her. A small defiance, a quiet insistence that the music should not be limited by their assumptions. She remembered her late mentor, a kind and patient teacher who had once told her that music is truth and emotion, not just notes on a page. Those words echoed in her mind, giving her strength. Her thoughts shifted back to the long hours she had spent alone at the piano. Nights when the street outside was empty, and only the moonlight fell across the keys. Times when she had struggled to master a difficult passage, her fingers aching, her patience tested, and yet she had persisted. No one had seen those hours. No one had understood the determination behind her quiet demeanor. Now all of that dedication seemed to gather inside her, a reservoir of passion waiting for a moment like this. She felt the temptation to add a small flourish, to let a note linger just a little longer, to bend the melody with her own emotion. Her fingers itched to explore, to push beyond the expectations of the audience. She hesitated. The gentle voice in her mind reminded her to stay within the requested boundaries, to play the simple tune. But another part of her, the part that had been silent for so long, urged her to let the music speak freely, to let the fire she had held inside finally show. Her first few measures played smoothly, carefully, measured in the way they had asked. Yet with each note, she felt a growing warmth in her chest, a subtle excitement that suggested she could go further. She glanced briefly at the audience. Most were polite, some indifferent, but a few watched with quiet curiosity, sensing a depth they did not yet understand. That small recognition gave her confidence. Perhaps they could hear the truth in the music, even if they were not fully aware of it. She let herself imagine the story she wanted to tell. The music was not just notes. It was the story of her quiet struggles, of late nights filled with practice, of moments when she felt like giving up and yet chose to continue. Each note could carry a memory, each pause a reflection of her persistence. The room seemed to breathe with her, the audience settling into the rhythm, almost unconsciously matching the pulse of her fingers. A sudden thought made her heart skip. What if she went too far? What if her music startled them, or worse, what if they dismissed it as too much? The fear lingered for a moment, but she reminded herself that this was not about pleasing everyone. This was about letting the music be true, letting her own voice speak. She closed her eyes again and let that resolve sink in. The simple tune could wait. For now, the music belonged to her. The room was silent except for the soft sound of the piano. She began to add subtle variations, small changes in tempo, gentle crescendos, letting the notes breathe and flow naturally. Her hands moved with confidence, and she felt the music grow richer, fuller. The audience remained attentive, some leaning forward slightly, others still cautious, but all listening more closely than before. They were beginning to hear more than just a simple tune. They were hearing her story. She paused briefly, taking a breath, letting her fingers rest lightly on the keys. The silence felt heavy, yet it was filled with possibility. The eyes watching her now were no longer just expecting a simple performance. There was curiosity, a subtle shift in energy. She could sense it. The fire she had carried inside for so long was beginning to ignite, and it was contagious. Memories of her past struggles surfaced again, but this time they felt less like burdens and more like fuel. The times she had been underestimated, overlooked, or dismissed became threads in the tapestry of her music. She realized that the pressure she felt was not just from the audience but also from herself, a desire to honor her journey and the countless hours of dedication. That realization steadied her, giving her a calm determination that blended perfectly with the passion growing inside her. Her fingers moved faster now, more confidently, exploring the piano with a sense of freedom she had rarely allowed herself. Small improvisations slipped in naturally, moments of expression that carried her emotion without breaking the melody. The audience noticed the change, subtle at first, then more pronounced. Whispers of surprise passed among a few, but most simply leaned in, drawn by the authenticity and intensity of the performance. She could feel the room responding. Some faces softened, a few eyes glistened with emotion, and a small child at the front clapped quietly, enchanted by the unexpected depth of the music. The polite expectation of a simple tune had shifted. Something real, something alive was unfolding. She realized that the pressure she had felt was transforming into energy, and that energy was becoming part of the music itself. Time seemed to stretch, each note resonating longer, each pause meaningful. She was no longer just playing to fulfill a request. She was telling a story, sharing a part of herself that had been hidden for too long. The room, once filled with polite listeners, had become a shared space of emotion and connection. Her confidence grew, and with it, the fire of her performance. By the end of the piece, she felt a quiet triumph. She had taken the simple tune they had requested and infused it with her own experience, her own passion, her own truth. The audience, still quiet, was no longer just watching. They were listening, feeling, and perhaps beginning to understand the depth behind the shy figure at the piano. She lifted her hands from the keys, a small, satisfied smile touching her lips. She had faced the pressure, embraced it, and transformed it into something meaningful. The music had done more than fill the room. It had marked the beginning of a change, one that would ripple far beyond the walls of the small community center. The first few minutes had passed, and the simple tune she had begun with was now transforming under her fingers. Each note carried a little more courage, a little more feeling, and she could feel the room beginning to change around her. What had started as a polite, expected performance was slowly becoming something alive. Her heart raced, but not with fear this time. It was excitement, the thrill of possibility. She thought about all the times she had been told to stay small, to keep her music quiet, to play only what was safe. Tonight, in this small room filled with polite strangers, she had the chance to push against that expectation. The idea sparked inside her and she found herself taking a small risk. Her fingers, guided by years of practice and the hidden fire she had always carried, began to move faster, more boldly. She added small embellishments, subtle changes in rhythm, variations in tone that brought the music to life in ways she had only dared to imagine in her quiet room. The audience noticed the change immediately. Some leaned forward slightly, curious. Others exchanged glances, surprised by the unexpected depth and emotion emerging from the once simple tune. Whispers spread quietly through the crowd, soft expressions of awe and surprise. She felt a thrill, but she did not let it distract her. Each note mattered, and she was intent on telling a story through her playing. This was not just music. It was a reflection of every quiet struggle, every late night, every moment she had believed in herself when no one else did. Her hands danced across the keys, sometimes gentle, sometimes forceful, moving with a fluidity that seemed almost natural, as if the music itself guided them. She imagined herself back in her small apartment, practicing alone with no audience, no expectations, only the pure joy of creating something meaningful. That feeling grounded her even as the performance took on a life of its own, allowing her to mix precision with passion, control with freedom. The audience's reaction grew more noticeable. Eyes widened, lips parted in surprise, and a few held their breath, caught off guard by the unexpected intensity. A woman at the back whispered, "She's amazing," and it carried through the room like a quiet ripple. Children at the front, usually fidgety and distracted, sat still, entranced by the music, their small hands folded in their laps. The shy, polite smiles of before had vanished, replaced by genuine attention and engagement. She allowed herself to smile faintly as she continued, a quiet acknowledgement of the connection forming between her and the listeners. The simple tune they had requested was gone, replaced by something richer, more complex, something that spoke not only to her own experiences, but to the shared emotions of anyone listening closely. She could feel it in the air, the subtle shift from polite expectation to genuine wonder, and it filled her with a warmth she had never known on stage. There was a moment when she hesitated, unsure if she should continue pushing the music beyond what was expected. But she remembered the quiet voice of her mentor, the encouragement she had received years ago to let her emotions guide her playing. The memory gave her courage. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the chance to show not just her skill, but the depth of her feeling, the fire that had always burned quietly inside her. She let herself take the risk, trusting her fingers, her instincts, and the music itself. With a deep breath, she allowed the melody to shift dramatically. The music rose and fell like waves, each chord carrying more intensity, more emotion than before. The audience gasped softly, a collective recognition that this was no ordinary performance. Her heart pounded in rhythm with the keys, a physical manifestation of the energy that flowed from her soul to the piano and into the room. She felt the music grow, expand, and fill every corner of the space. As she played, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The quiet afternoons practicing alone, the moments of doubt, the encouragement of the few who believed in her, and the long nights imagining a moment like this. All of it converged in her hands, in the music that now carried both her story and her soul. Each note was a statement, a small act of courage, a declaration that she was more than anyone had expected. The audience responded in kind. Faces softened, eyes glistened with emotion, and the soft hum of whispers filled the room as people shared their quiet astonishment. Even those who had seemed skeptical at first were leaning in, drawn by the authenticity of her performance. She could feel the tension of expectation dissolve, replaced by something far more powerful: connection. For the first time, she realized that her music could touch others, move them, and communicate in ways words never could. She allowed herself to play more freely now, the music flowing naturally, unbound by the constraints of the requested simple tune. Her fingers moved with confidence, her body swaying slightly with the rhythm, her mind fully immersed in the sound. She could feel the energy of the room responding, feeding back into her performance, creating a cycle of emotion and expression that seemed to lift her above her previous doubts and fears. At one point, she glanced up briefly, noticing the expressions of those around her. An elderly man had tears in his eyes, a young woman smiled softly, and children watched wide-eyed, captivated by the fire and life in the music. She felt a quiet pride, not in herself alone, but in the shared experience that had formed between her and the audience. The simple tune had transformed into something much greater, something that carried meaning, emotion, and presence. The final moments of the performance were a whirlwind of intensity. She allowed the music to soar, each note a culmination of everything she had carried silently inside her. The sound filled the room, echoing off the walls, resonating in the hearts of those who listened. When she finally let her hands rest on the keys, there was a pause, a silence so deep that it felt almost sacred. The room seemed to hold its breath, absorbing the power and emotion of what had just unfolded. The applause came slowly at first, hesitant, then growing louder and louder, filling the space with a warmth that wrapped around her like a gentle embrace. She felt a mixture of relief and exhilaration, her chest swelling with the realization that she had risked everything, and it had paid off in a way she could never have imagined. The simple tune had become a gateway to something extraordinary, and she had walked through it bravely. People approached her afterward, their faces glowing with admiration and surprise. Some shook her hand, others simply smiled and nodded, and a few whispered words of praise she would carry with her forever. The quiet fire that had always lived inside her had finally been seen, recognized, and appreciated. It was a moment that would stay with her, a turning point that marked the beginning of something new. As she left the piano, she felt lighter, freer, and more confident than she had ever felt before. The room, the audience, and the music had become part of her story, and she realized that the fire she had let out tonight would continue to guide her. The simple tune that had been requested had been transformed into a testament of courage, passion, and authenticity, and she knew that from this moment on, she would never again doubt the power of her own music. The music had grown, and with it, the atmosphere in the room had transformed. What had begun as a polite expectation of a simple tune had now turned into something alive and unpredictable. Every note she played carried emotion, and every chord seemed to ripple through the audience, touching hearts in ways she had only dreamed of. She felt it too, the energy that connected her to everyone present, a silent thread weaving through the room. She could see it in their faces. The polite curiosity had disappeared, replaced by attentive eyes, some wide with wonder, others glistening with emotion. The child at the front who had been fidgeting before now sat perfectly still, eyes locked on her fingers as they danced across the keys. The elderly man's shoulders relaxed, and he inhaled deeply, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Even those who had seemed skeptical leaned forward, pulled in by the raw honesty of the music. The fire she had allowed to come through her fingers now seemed to have a life of its own. It was no longer just her music. It was the energy in the room, a force that moved with each note. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the sound fill her completely, feeling the vibrations travel up her arms and into her chest. The audience was no longer a distant presence. They were part of the performance, breathing with her, feeling with her, reacting to the story she was telling through the piano. Her mind wandered to the countless hours she had spent alone, practicing, learning to trust her instincts, to feel the music rather than just play it. All those lonely nights had led to this moment, and she allowed herself to acknowledge it. The music was not perfect in the technical sense, but it was alive, breathing, and full of truth. That was what mattered. That was what connected her to the listeners in a way nothing else could. She began to experiment with dynamics, allowing the softest notes to linger, giving them weight and space. Then, she struck a chord more forceful, letting it roll through the room like a small thunderclap, startling in its intensity but beautiful. The audience responded in real time. Some leaned back, eyes wide, almost holding their breath. Others whispered softly to one another, sharing their surprise and admiration. The room was no longer filled with polite murmurs but with a palpable sense of awe. Her heart raced, but she felt a calm underneath it, a steady confidence that allowed her to continue. She knew she was taking a risk, pushing beyond the expected, but the connection she felt with the audience made it feel natural. She allowed the music to guide her, following the rhythm of her emotions, the flow of her energy, the subtle cues from the listeners' reactions. Each note was deliberate yet spontaneous, a balance of control and freedom. She could feel the physicality of the performance now. Her arms moved fluidly, her back straight but relaxed, her fingers flying over the keys with precision and grace. The room seemed to respond to her movements, the audience leaning in or shifting slightly as they absorbed each sound. She had become part of a living dialogue, one that spoke without words, connecting her inner world to everyone around her. A wave of emotion swept through her as she glanced at the listeners. Faces glowed with admiration, eyes shimmered with recognition, and a few smiles broke through the intensity, tentative but genuine. The music was no longer just her own. It belonged to everyone present, a shared experience that bridged the gap between performer and audience. She had never felt anything like it before, and she realized that this was the power of true expression, the kind that could move people in ways words never could. She continued to play, weaving subtle variations into the melody, exploring the depth of the piano's sound. Sometimes soft, sometimes strong, she let the music rise and fall like waves, following the natural flow of emotion. She could feel her own energy feeding back into the room, and the audience responded, their engagement amplifying the intensity of the performance. It was as if the music had created a loop of connection, each note strengthening the bond between her and the listeners. The child at the front clapped quietly at a particularly lively passage, and she smiled, letting the innocence of the gesture remind her of the joy of music. The older man nodded slightly, as if acknowledging a truth he could not put into words. The whispers of surprise grew, but they were now filled with genuine admiration rather than skepticism. She felt proud, not just for herself, but for the unspoken story that had emerged through the music, one that had been invisible until now. She paused for a brief moment, letting her fingers hover above the keys. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with anticipation, a shared breath between her and the audience. She felt their attention like a tangible presence, focused, patient, and expectant. The room seemed to hold its breath with her, waiting for the next note, the next phrase, the continuation of the story she was telling as she resumed. The music took on an even deeper character. She allowed herself to bend the melody, to emphasize certain notes, to linger on moments that felt significant. Each choice was instinctual, guided by the emotion that had been building inside her for years. She no longer worried about expectations or judgments. The music was pure, honest, and alive. The audience absorbed it fully, responding to the sincerity and intensity of her playing. Her mind drifted to the people who had underestimated her in the past. She had carried their doubts quietly, using them as fuel rather than allowing them to break her. Now, in this room, she could finally express the fire that had always lived inside her. The music was her voice, her statement, and it resonated not just with sound but with emotion, truth, and authenticity. She felt a sense of liberation, a freedom she had never experienced on stage before. The final minutes of the performance were a crescendo of energy and feeling. The room seemed to vibrate with the intensity, each chord resonating deeply. She allowed herself to play with abandon, trusting her instincts and the flow of the moment. The audience was fully engaged, leaning forward, some holding their breath, others whispering softly to one another. All of them connected by the shared experience of witnessing something extraordinary. When she finally lifted her hands from the keys, the room was silent for a moment, as if collectively processing what had just occurred. Then, applause began, hesitant at first, then growing louder and louder, filling the space with warmth and appreciation. She felt a rush of relief and exhilaration, a mixture of joy, pride, and a sense of achievement. She had transformed a simple request into something extraordinary, and the audience recognized it fully. People approached her afterward, faces glowing with admiration, some shaking her hand, others offering quiet words of praise. The experience had shifted something in the room, a transformation that extended beyond the music itself. She felt seen, appreciated, and acknowledged in a way that was entirely new. The simple tune that had been requested had become a vehicle for connection, expression, and recognition, and she realized that this was a moment she would carry with her forever. As she packed her things to leave, she looked around the room one last time. The energy lingered, a quiet hum of appreciation and emotion. She knew that the fire she had unleashed tonight would continue to influence her, shaping her future performances and giving her the confidence to explore her music more freely. The room had transformed along with her, and she felt grateful for the opportunity to share her inner world through the piano, to connect with others, and to leave a lasting impression on everyone who had listened. The applause had faded, but the energy from the performance still lingered in the room. She sat for a moment at the piano, breathing deeply, feeling a quiet satisfaction and relief. The music had done more than fill the space. It had touched the people around her in a way she had only hoped for. She could feel it in the soft smiles, the bright eyes, and the subtle nods of approval from those who had been skeptical at first. The simple tune they had asked for had become something far greater, a story of courage and passion shared silently through sound. As she packed her sheet music and notebook, a few people approached her cautiously, almost as if they were afraid to break the spell of the moment. One older woman with gentle eyes complimented her playing, saying that she had never heard music with such emotion. Another listener, a young man, admitted that he had not expected to be so moved. Each compliment filled her with warmth, a mixture of pride and humility. It was one thing to play alone in her room, another to have her music acknowledged and appreciated by strangers who had truly listened. A local music teacher, who had been in the audience, approached her with a small card. He spoke softly, telling her that he saw potential in her that went far beyond what anyone had expected. He offered guidance, the chance to attend lessons and join small performances in the area. She listened, astonished, a mixture of excitement and disbelief filling her chest. It was an opportunity she had never imagined, a door that had been quietly waiting for someone brave enough to knock. Her hands trembled slightly as she accepted the card, grateful and a little overwhelmed. The audience lingered, some sharing recordings they had captured on their phones, whispers of admiration passing between them. Her performance was already spreading quietly beyond the room, creating ripples she could not yet fully grasp. She realized that one moment, one choice to let herself express fully, had the power to influence others, to reach hearts she had never known existed. It was a profound awakening, not just for them, but for herself as well. She remembered the shy, quiet girl who had walked into the room earlier, unsure and nervous, worried that she might fail or be misunderstood. That girl had played beautifully, but she had not yet known the full effect of her courage. Now, as she listened to the murmurs of admiration and saw the genuine smiles of those around her, She understood that she had changed something in that room. The simple tune had been the key, but it was her willingness to step beyond expectation that had truly made the difference. The child at the front, who had been so captivated, shyly approached her, holding a small drawing of a piano. The child said nothing at first, simply offering it with a smile. She knelt down, accepting it gently, touched by the innocence and sincerity. It was a small gesture, but it carried a message more powerful than words. Her music had inspired someone else, sparked imagination, and perhaps planted the seed of a lifelong love for expression. That realization added another layer of fulfillment to the evening. She thanked each person individually, her voice soft but steady, feeling the genuine connection in each interaction. She could see the impact her performance had made, and it filled her with a quiet pride. It was not about recognition or fame. It was about being seen, truly seen, for the first time in a meaningful way. Each smile, each word of encouragement, was a reflection of the honesty she had allowed to flow through her music. As she stepped outside, the cool evening air greeted her. The city streets were quieter now, bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. She walked slowly, reflecting on the evening, feeling a mixture of exhilaration and calm. The performance had been more than she had imagined, but it was only the beginning. The fire she had uncovered within herself, the confidence she had gained, and the connections she had made would continue to shape her future. Her phone buzzed with messages. Some were simple notes of thanks, others shared the recordings from the evening, and a few came from people outside the immediate gathering who had already seen the clips online. She felt a sense of wonder. One small act, one brave choice to step beyond expectations, had touched people far beyond the room she had performed in. The ripple effect of courage and expression was already unfolding, and she was part of it. She thought back to the countless hours of practice, the late nights filled with solitude and determination. Each moment had led to this evening, and now she could see the results. Not just the admiration or opportunities that had emerged, but the realization that she had the power to shape her path through persistence and authenticity. The music had been the medium, but her courage had been the catalyst. Walking home, she felt a sense of quiet transformation. The shy, uncertain feelings that had accompanied her to the performance were now replaced with a sense of possibility and hope. She realized that she could continue to share her music, that her voice, her fire, and her dedication could reach others in ways she had never dared to imagine. Each note she played in the future could carry the same honesty and emotion, and she would never again allow doubt to hold her back. That night, as she sat by the window and listened to the quiet hum of the city, she reflected on the journey she had undertaken. A simple request for a tune had become a turning point, a moment that marked the beginning of a new chapter. She felt gratitude for the audience, for the opportunity, and for the courage she had found within herself. The evening had changed her not just in how others saw her, but in how she saw herself. She was no longer just a quiet girl who played in solitude. She was a musician with a voice, a fire, and the ability to connect deeply with those who were willing to listen. She knew the future held more challenges, more performances, and more moments that would test her courage. But the memory of this night, the sense of accomplishment, and the warmth of the audience's recognition would guide her. She felt ready, capable, and determined to continue growing, exploring, and expressing herself through her music. As sleep approached, she closed her eyes, hearing the echo of the applause in her mind. She smiled, knowing that she had taken a simple opportunity and transformed it into something meaningful, powerful, and unforgettable. The music had been her bridge to others, her declaration of courage, and her first step into a future filled with possibility. She drifted off with the quiet assurance that no matter what lay ahead, the fire within her would continue to shine, guiding her path and inspiring anyone willing to listen.